Those that are here in person, those that are watching on the Zoom, and those that are watching the recording afterwards, thank you very much for coming to our April edition of our HR Council meeting. And we are very fortunate with a last second kind of a cancellation shift that Danielle Crane, associate with Kegler Brown Hill Ritter, could pick up the slack and help us present for this topic, which was actually a requested topic from some of the HR Council members at a previous session. They wanted to hear about discrimination and harassment. And again, thank you to Danielle for being able to present on it. So again, she'll be covering discrimination, management, discrimination and harassment.
All right, thank you so much. It's nice to meet all of you virtually, and thanks for having me today. So again, I am an attorney at Kegler Brown Hill Ritter. I primarily focus my practice in labor and employment, and I kind of run the full gamut of those types of things, from hiring people on, getting documents in order, dealing with issues and questions as they pop up, like discrimination and harassment questions, harassment investigations, things like that. Help with letting people go. And then, unfortunately, when things do evolve into charges or lawsuits, I also help out with those as well. So with that background, part of what I do is helping to go into different organizations and train their management employees on how do they set themselves up for success in terms of discrimination and harassment. What are the types of things that they need to be looking out for with the employees that they manage, and what can they do to help the company avoid any kind of liability if, like I said, it does turn into a claim or a charge down the road. So to kind of keep the goal of talking to you guys today about discrimination and harassment, what I've decided to focus this presentation on is how you as HR managers can work with your management staff to get them properly trained. And then I also touch a little bit on the essential elements that you should make sure are included in your policies, because I know that was something that was supposed to be touched on as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. First off, the goals when you're training your management employees on these two things, you want to make sure that you explain that the company is committed to providing equal employment opportunities and does not discriminate against qualified individuals on the basis of insert the, 20 different things that come after that statement. And, explain to your managers that that's what makes this such a great place to work, and that's something that you want to make sure we continue. You want to make sure that they understand what illegal discrimination is. I'll get into that a little bit later, but I think that with this being so common in the media, it is something that's a little bit misunderstood. So when I give these, I try to make sure I really hone in on what exactly we're looking at and what they need to focus on. And then I always, include the company's policies if they provide them to me ahead of time, and kind of go over them, how to implement them, what the reporting structure is, and things like that. So I was going to start with this intro to managers to make sure that I'm grabbing their attention and they understand that, just because they've heard of discrimination and harassment in the media or in the news or in TV shows or movies, those are buzzwords, but they also commonly get misused. And there is a difference between what people sometimes refer to as discrimination and harassment and what really is illegal and what they need to be watching out for in their jobs. Because, part of their jobs is to make decisions, and there are decisions that they're going to have to quote unquote discriminate by the dictionary definition of that. Hiring qualified people, that's making a choice under the dictionary definition. Yes, maybe that's discrimination, but is it illegal? No. So I always try to, at the start, maybe give some examples, get people engaged so that they don't tune me out and think, oh, I know exactly what you're going to say. I don't need to listen to this. Because really it's your management staff who are the ones, when I get called and, there's a claim, it comes down to what was management doing and what was happening on the ground with these people. And you guys can't be everywhere all the time. So it's important that they understand what their role in this is. And I always start by talking about employment at will, because I think that's, for us, it's easily we all get it, but managers don't totally understand. They think I can fire someone for anything, good reason, bad reason, it doesn't matter. And so I always kind of start by explaining that and saying, discrimination and harassment is the qualifier there, that it can't be illegal. And then, like I said, I try to give them examples of, the dictionary definition of discrimination is different than the legal definition of discrimination. And we are focusing on how do they make decisions in their jobs and stay away from that illegal discrimination. And so I give these examples, like, you're going to have to make decisions based on performance, and you might have to discipline someone because they violate the rules, or, make alterations to the job because it's just a necessity of, our business. Those things are fine. What we're worried about is illegal discrimination. And I think it's a lot less common nowadays for someone to say, oh, I didn't hire this person because she's a woman. I don't see that happen. So what I try to tie this back to for managers is that it's not that obvious discrimination that we're thinking about here. It's more, did you make assumptions about that person and that influenced your decision on how you would act? Or is there some kind of connection that could be made between your decision and a potential protected characteristic? So I try to let them know that we don't think that they're going to go out there and just discriminate against people, but it's a lot more nuanced than that. So I explained that illegal discrimination has two parts. The first is the idea of a qualifying action, and then that being taken for an illegal reason. And I think it's important to spend some time, and this is exactly my slide on qualifying actions. What that is, it's decisions that impact the terms and conditions of someone's employment. So everybody knows about hiring and firing. I don't talk about that much. What I focus on more is these other ideas, not selecting someone for a promotion, or demoting someone, or transferring them to a new job. Discipline can be that, not giving someone a discretionary bonus. Those are all things that managers just don't always think about. And so I think it's important to let them know that it's not just in the beginning and the end of the employment relationship, that this can come up throughout. And so they need to be on guard, and they need to be taking steps to comply with your policy and your record keeping requirements throughout the entire time that someone is employed. And then the second piece is the easier piece. It can't be based on an illegal reason. Almost everybody knows all of these. I like to add in here that it's these are usually things that you can tell just by seeing someone. You know what race we are, you know what sex we are, you maybe know what age we are. So that's kind of the traditional easy category. Sorry, I'm getting some feedback. So if at all ever you can't hear me, just please let me know. I'm very concerned about that when I'm giving these virtual presentations. I don't want to just be talking for 5 minutes and no one knows that we can't hear each other. So let me know.
I'm Gay. Sorry, I had us unmuted because we lost your audio for just a couple of seconds, but I think we picked up everything you were getting at, I think. So.
Okay, good. That's what I was worried about. So I wanted to stop and pause and make sure that we were. All right. So then the categories that I spend a bit more time on with managers, aside from those other ones, you can run through those pretty quickly, but the ones that I like to drill down on a little bit more are disability and sex, because these are what I call multifaceted. There are a couple different ways that they can pop up. I think traditionally managers tend to think of disability as, they would those other characteristics. You're discriminating against someone because they're disabled, or for sex because they're a male or a woman. But it's a little bit more tricky than that. So with disability discrimination, as I'm sure you all know, but your managers don't know, this can be, that typical treating someone different because they have a disability, but it's also the accommodation piece of it. And that's super important to touch on with managers because, like I said before, they're the ones who are on the ground. They get those requests or tips first, and they need to know how to handle it so that they can properly escalate it to you. I can't even think of the amount of times I've heard someone say, oh, yeah, we missed that. I had a case where there was a text message, someone asking for help, and the manager just didn't respond because he thought it was, more an issue for HR. So I always spend some time with this because you don't want to be in that position where someone says, oh, I didn't think it was really my place. I was waiting for that person to talk to you. Explain a manager's role in the process and what you expect of them. So this is kind of my slide for disparate treatment on with regard to the ADA. I just kind of run through these questions with managers so that they know these are the things you need to think about and the questions that you need to be asking yourself when you're going through something like this. And then, like I said, what I spend a little bit more time on is the accommodation side of it. Running through these same questions with managers and just explaining to them that there is no kind of magic words that an employee needs to use when they send that text message at 2 a.m. that says, hey, I'm just having a hard time. I don't remember exactly what the text in this case said, but hey, I'm having a hard time. I think if I could just do this, it would make it a lot easier. Recognizing those types of requests and knowing where it goes from there, what their role in the reporting structure. And then going back to this slide, I said, I always spend a little bit more time on disability. Those are the things I go into there. But then also you need to drill down a little bit more with regard to sex. The easy one is the traditional claims, but there's also these, what I guess I've labeled here as new age claims. These are more recent with the Supreme Court coming out in 2020 with a case that said sexual orientation discrimination is covered. And then a little bit before that, back in the 90s, some things about sex stereotyping. So I go into detail about those. This is exactly my slide that I use for traditional sex discrimination. It's pretty easy. People get it. They've heard about it. It's been in more movies than probably anything else. And I just explained to them that, the key in some of these things is this concept of similarly situated employees. I think that's important to touch on with managers so that they understand the impact of treating someone one way and someone else a different way. And that that concept ties back to what I mentioned at the beginning, where some things aren't really illegal discrimination. Someone might label them that because they perceive them as unfair. And so this is a great chance to kind of tie that concept back in. For example, we had an employer call us. An employee was claiming that he had been discriminated against because in the department, a manager was frequently asking a lot of other employees out to lunch, but wasn't inviting this man. Was that based on his sex or any other? I don't think he had any other protected characteristics. And not that, you know, being a man was a winner here, but, you know, we explained to the employer that no, this isn't illegal discrimination. The manager was probably not inviting that person out to lunch because she was a woman and everybody else was a woman and he was a man. More likely it was just a camaraderie thing. You should talk to the manager about the, you know, culture that you want to cultivate, but that's not illegal discrimination. And then I, you know, would tie that in with an example where it was, and it's that same concept of people who are female being treated differently than the people who are males. Lunch maybe doesn't do it, but you know, you can think of a million examples where you know, something else does qualify. So I try to tie that back in, and then again, it goes to one of the goals that I said at the beginning of the presentation, which is to kind of explain to them how this impacts your culture and what kind of environment you want to cultivate for your employees. So getting back on the different aspects of sex discrimination that you'll have to cover. One is sex stereotyping. Like I said, this one's been around for a little while, since the 80s or 90s. So some people are familiar with it, but generally it's, you know, not conforming to societal norms or typical expectations for that person's gender. I don't see it come up as often, but I always try to touch on it with managers and their trainings. And then the bigger one right now, which is sexual orientation and gender identity. Like I said, there was a Supreme Court case that came out 2 years ago that said, it was the first time that the federal government had said, no, this is absolutely not okay. This is covered. People had been using what I touched on before, sex stereotyping as an avenue for redress with these types of claims. But now that this court case has come out, this is the new hot topic. We just had a case that settled on this. It's in the news, it's on people's minds. I would spend some time on this, what it means. Even though this has been protected under Ohio law for a long time, the ramifications now are much bigger because it's now explicitly covered under Title VII. And then two other forms of discrimination that I touch on in a maybe just a bit more detail, but I don't spend a lot of time on it. Genetic information, that's GINA, and I assume everyone is somewhat familiar with it, but I'll just go over it in case, because like I said, I don't spend a lot of time on these because they don't really ever come up. But what it means is like a scenario where maybe a manager is saying, oh, I don't want to promote Danielle because I know that her mother died of breast cancer, and she's been saying that, you know, she's been tested for the breast cancer gene, and, you know, she might have a long road ahead of her with all of that stuff, and I just don't know if she can commit here. that's one of the ways I guess it would come up, but it, like I said, it doesn't come up that often because employers don't often know people's genetic information. As time goes on, people might share it, but really that's like the only thing I've ever even heard about coming up in the workplace. The other one is familial status. This is somewhat related to sex. So like I said, I don't spend a lot of time on it, but it's kind of someone's caregiving responsibilities, really. If they're single, married, do they have kids? Do they have a parent who they have to take care of? It's this concept of their caregiving needs, meaning that they can't do a good job at work. And with these, a point I always like to make at this point is that managers maybe start to see a trend when I'm talking about assumptions that you might make based on these things. Like, because this person has kids in daycare, they can't work overtime because they're going to have to go to daycare and pick them up. The assumptions is really what get people in trouble and why my phone rings a lot and I work the hours that I do. It's like I said, not because people are saying I don't want to hire that person or promote that person because she's a woman. It's more of these assumptions. So I just remind managers at this point that assumptions can be dangerous, and we don't do that as a company. That's not the kind of culture that we want to cultivate. And tie that back in again. So as I promised, I will hit on a couple things that you should have in your policy, because I know that's what was, that's one of the things that was supposed to be talked about today. You absolutely have to say that the company won't tolerate any form of discrimination and list out every single one of those categories. Race, national origin, remember to add sexual orientation and gender identity if you haven't updated your policy after that Supreme Court case. As I mentioned, it's been illegal under Ohio law for a long time, but I know that there's still people that haven't updated their policies to include that yet. So if you haven't, make sure that you do. Some kind of message that says anyone who thinks that they've been discriminated against or witnessed discrimination should notify this person. I also usually, when I am drafting policies, I think best practices would be to add in a second line of reporting. So, this example says you should notify management. If the person doesn't feel comfortable reporting to management, they can also talk to HR or, the company president, company board, just making sure that there's multiple avenues there for reporting so that you don't get a claim from an employee who says, well, I couldn't do that because the only person you told me to report this to was the person who was discriminating. And then obviously a message that retaliation absolutely won't be tolerated. If you report or participate in our investigations of discrimination, you can do so without fear of retaliation. There's a million ways to say it. Just make sure that at least that buzzword is somewhere in your policy. And then other, best practices that you should probably include in there is, what we all always hear: anyone who's found in violation of this policy is subject to discipline up to and including termination. And that's for discrimination or the retaliation piece. And then on retaliation,
Danielle?
yeah.
Real quick, back to the writing of the plan, you said subject to, does it have to cover some sort of a process for getting down to the bottom of it, does that need to be in there in terms of what's conducted when someone says that there's an issue, what that looks like, or?
Yeah. So I would typically include language in mine that says, and again, this is a best practice, but if you submitted it to the EEOC without this, I think that you'd probably get by. But a tip, what I always like to include when I am the one drafting that is to say, we will investigate complaints promptly. Number 2, we will keep the investigation confidential to the extent possible. And then the third is that piece about, if we determine that there is a violation, the person is subject to discipline up to and including termination. Those are the 3 big ones. You could go into more detail if you want about the process. I don't know that it's necessary. I don't know that I've seen that all that much. But yes, I think it's a good thing to let people know what it looks like. But again, I think that if you had a charge filed against you and the EEOC wanted to see your policy, if that was missing, would they hold it against you? No. Would they like your policy better if you had it? Absolutely. So yeah, then going on to retaliation, because I mentioned that in the policy, it's what I always put at the end, because logically, if we're thinking about the steps of what happens, someone reports, you investigate, and it was after that you would have retaliation. So I kind of tried, like I said, I go over that policy with employees at the point where I just had it. And then I talk about retaliation, and I talk a little bit about the timeline. Like I just said, it's someone complains and then we look at it, and then it's something that happens after that. And I like to give the example here about how when we first started talking, we talked about, not everything that you do in your decision making is discriminatory. With talking to you guys, I gave that example of the person who wasn't invited out to lunch. Tying that back in here, something that may not qualify as discriminatory can qualify as retaliatory. So if that man who said everybody else is going out to lunch without me, if he had complained about something that was going on and then that started happening, then he might have a claim for retaliation. So I always try to make that distinction for management, because I've gone into so much detail about, making decisions as part of your job. That's the nature of why we hired you and brought you into this role. Just make sure that, you don't get into trouble in these ways. And then big caveat is with retaliation, it's a much more lax kind of threshold. And, you need to make sure that you maintain confidentiality to the extent, that we can, to avoid retaliation by other employees. And then also thinking about yourself, don't do anything that would be retaliatory. Sorry, here are a couple other tips that I give. We already touched on the second one, that what they do to be retaliatory isn't the same higher burden as it is to be considered discriminatory. But I also let them know that, it doesn't matter the results of the investigation or if what the employee reported was right or wrong. It's just the fact that something was reported creates this obligation. And I explained to them, going back to the lunch example, it's not that same concept as discrimination. Instead, it's anything that would maybe prevent the person from coming to you and talking to you again. it's this chilling effect on their likelihood to engage in protected activity. And I think those aren't things that are maybe common sense to a lot of managers. So those are things that I just quickly touch on when I talk about retaliation. I also talk to them about how timing is important. I think it helps for them to understand how you or I might evaluate these issues, so that then when they are in that spot, they already have that kind of decision-making framework in their mind. And that's where the timing part comes in. We all know that, the law tracks human nature, and that if someone hits you, you're more likely to hit them right away. And the law says, yes, that's common sense. We're gonna assume that too. But managers don't know the law on timing. So I try to explain to them, sometimes I use the joke, revenge is a dish best served cold. Obviously, I don't think that managers should be getting revenge on any of their employees, but if it at least helps them stick in their head that timing matters and turning around and doing something always is going to look bad, then at least they can take that away with them. But here, the things to talk about are, unless there's some intervening action, typically if there's some kind of protected activity and then one of those qualifying actions, the court or the EEOC or OCRC is going to assume right off the bat that it is illegal, and based on the protected characteristic or protected activity that the employee is complaining about. All right, and then I always save this for the end because I think that this is the most important piece of your training that you're going to talk to managers about. How do they avoid getting into the situation in the first place? What do they do to set themselves up and the company or organization up for success? Some of these are pretty straightforward, and you would obviously go into more detail about them, but making sure that expectations are clearly set, encouraging like an open door, open communication. If an employee says, I didn't report it because my manager was never available or he blew me off, that's not a good look. So making sure that they foster that kind of environment. If you receive a report or something that just makes you think, is this something I need to talk to HR about? Tell them, please talk to us immediately. If you get that text at 2 a.m. and you think, well, this sounds like something for HR, don't wait for the employee to call us. You call us the next morning. Don't call us at 2 a.m. I'm not trying to make your guys' phones ring off the hook in the middle of the night. But, tell them that that's why you're here. You can help evaluate these issues and give them advice. You can call me or the version of me that you use if it's something that's even a little bit trickier than you feel comfortable answering. But getting HR involved at the beginning, I always think is a good idea. And then the biggest piece that I try to stress with managers is it's all about keeping the right documentation. That's the biggest role that managers play in this process. I can't tell you how many times I have had HR director call me and say, hey, we want to fire this person. I feel like I know what you're going to say, but can you let me know what you think? And then they describe the situation and I say, okay, well, that sounds great. Is all of it documented? And they say, no, it's not. The manager didn't write any of this down. They're just telling me now. And so then what happens is that bad employee who everyone knows there's definitely a reason to let him or her go sticks around longer while we build up that paper file. So I try to stress to managers, one of the biggest things that you can do is when stuff goes wrong, document it. Make notes or memos to the file. It's okay if that's just a Word document with the date on it that gets saved, or if you want to shoot HR an email, at the time that it happens, Susie didn't show up for work today and didn't give us a doctor's note or anything. Then when Susie has a bunch of unexcused absences, we have that clear record. I also stressed to managers that verbal warnings are never just verbal.
Can you repeat that last one again, please?
The notes to a file.
The end of that, start of your next.
Okay, yeah. So on the notes to the file, I say, that's just something as simple as sending an email or creating a Word document with the date. This is what is happening and going on. And then I gave the example of maybe an attendance issue where we know that someone hasn't been showing up and they haven't been providing excuses. And if you notate that in the file, then we have a clear record of all of those times and can say, you weren't here on this day, this day, this day, this day, versus what happens a lot with me is someone calls and says, this person's not showing up. And then I say, okay, let's get detailed in the letter we're going to write to them. What are the days? How many absences do they have? And there's no record of that. So it's keeping those things in real time. Dates are super important there. Then I was moving on to another tip that I like to share, which is verbal warnings are never truly verbal warnings. They always need to have some kind of documentation with them, whether that's a quick follow-up email to the employee where you kind of summarize, this is what we talked about. And, following up on that with those summary emails, including a statement at the end that says, let me know if I got anything wrong here, so that you don't land in a situation where the employee says, no, that's absolutely not what was said. If I go at trial to pull out an email and they say, no, that's not right, and I say, well, the person specifically asked you if it was right and you didn't say that it wasn't, a jury is not going to like that. So I always remind managers of that process as well. I encourage them in their documentation not to make conclusory statements.
Danielle, can you repeat that last thing just now?
Yeah, I like to remind managers not to make conclusory statements in their documentation. So for example, saying, Tom didn't show up for work, I think he has a drinking problem. Or Tom is always late, I think that it's alcohol. That doesn't do me much good. And that goes back to the same thing with, making assumptions about people. Instead, I would rather have facts that say, Tom was late for work, he smelled like alcohol, Tom was late for work again, he was stumbling and tripping. Stick to the facts, don't stick to conclusions. Or another thing that I hate when I look at employee records is someone just saying a general legal term, person was insubordinate. That doesn't do me a lot of good. I would rather have the facts about why that person is insubordinate. And then I guess just a couple of other things that I try to remind people, which are a little bit more minor. If they're handwriting stuff, make sure it's legible. You'd be shocked how many times that comes up. If it's something that the employee needs to sign and they're not willing to sign it, making that notation like signature refused, just cleaning up the little pieces that sometimes fall between the cracks, because, like I said, the point to hit home with them is, you never know where these things can go, but you guys are the ones on the ground creating the facts that maybe someday the lawyers will have to look at. And the biggest part of that for managers is in their record keeping. So I spend a lot of time on this part of it, especially the documentation, and again, making reports to HR and getting them involved early on at the beginning as soon as possible. And then I'll flip over to harassment. It's a lot of it is similar, so we can kind of fly through this one, but I promise I will still give you, the talking points and talk about your harassment policy. Your goals for your harassment training are pretty similar. Let them know what's illegal harassment. Highlight the new forms of harassment that are prevalent in the workplace. I will go into that in more detail in a second. And then go over the policy and what the employee's role is in implementing that policy. Really similar to discrimination. And then also, I usually let them know what the company's obligations are for investigating and kind of what the company's liability could be. And I will touch on that for you guys as well. So again, it's talking about illegal versus legal harassment. It's the same kind of concept, sometimes people joke, maybe you want to foster a friendly department or a collegial department that goes out and gets drinks, and that's fine. But you have to be aware that there is a line that gets crossed and know what it is so that you or anyone in your department doesn't cross it, is kind of what I explain. Easy part is it's all of the same stuff that you would have already talked to them about with discrimination, so you don't have to spend a lot of time on that. What I do spend a bit more time on is the two types of harassment, quid pro quo and hostile work environment. I think a lot of people know about quid pro quo harassment because that's what's been in movies lately. Like sometimes when I'm doing these, I show a clip from Legally Blonde where he says, the professor says, if you help me out, I'll help you out in getting a good job with a big firm. Or there was that Bombshell movie recently. I'm sure there's a good clip in there. My clips are just old at this point. But it's that this for that. People pick up on this pretty quickly, and I also don't see it happen as much. So what I spend more time on is the hostile work environment form of harassment. That's also what I think managers have if they're going back to quid pro quo, if they are, for lack of a better word, dumb enough to do that, then that's on them. Point it out, obviously talk about it, but I think that they have a bit more control over this hostile work environment piece of it. And so I actually tell them all of the 5 legal elements for proving this, that it's offensive or unwelcome. With this, I kind of talk about, this is when we're looking, if a person comes to you and says, hey, so-and-so is calling me a name, I'm not comfortable with it. Or if you overhear it and you think that sounds offensive, I think a reasonable person would be offensive. Those are triggers. If it's based on a protected characteristic, that one's pretty easy, but give them some examples there. It has to be sufficiently severe or pervasive. With this, I kind of give them an analogy to a graph, and I make a joke that's like, if it's really bad, you only get one shot at it. It's that graph of really bad one time, not as bad, more frequent. But it's a joke, but the idea is that, as things go on, they get more pervasive, or if it's really severe, then you have to step in quickly. If it's less severe, maybe it flies under the radar a little bit longer, but once you catch wind, you really have to do something. That impairs the person's work or creates an intimidating, abusive, or offensive work environment. When I talk about that, I go and I'm giving you guys kind of in a brief, I'm not actually training you, so I'm just trying to give you my talking points. But when I talk about this, I talk about things to look for are an employee who is doing well, and then maybe their performance drops off. They used to go out with their coworkers for lunch, and now they're saying no, eating lunch in the bathroom, you know, like the disengagement pieces or the performance falling off are things that just should tip off a manager that maybe something isn't right, and they can dig into it and make sure that, you know, the person is okay and that it's not harassment, or if it's, you know, something in their personal life, how you guys want to kind of handle helping your employees and what kind of culture you want to cultivate again. And then the liability piece. So I talked early on when I said these are your goals about new age and traditional. That goes into the types of conduct that can be considered harassment. And I think it's important for managers because I just had this come up in a deposition where people think that it's only stuff that happens at work and it's only, you know, these old school things. Someone touched someone inappropriately, someone made a cat call, a bad joke or something like that. But it's more than that. Now with technology and social media, it doesn't have to occur at work. It can be, you know, sending Snapchats. The case where this came up in the deposition, there was a lot of Facebook posts and tagging in different like memes and stuff like that. There were Facebook Messenger messages, you know, everybody getting together for drinks after work and things being said. So I think it's important to remind managers that, you know, when you get into a deposition, you can't say, oh, well, it never happened at work. That doesn't matter now. Work extends, life extends across the day. And then I remind them that, you know, we can be liable if we knew or should have known that there was a problem. So you can't bury your head in the sand. If you see those signs, you know something's going on, again, you need to get HR involved in the beginning so that we can start doing something about it. If the harassment is by a supervisor, that's legally, there's a word for it, but it's almost like saying automatic liability, and you can defend against it, but it's definitely an uphill battle. And I remind supervisors that they can be individually named in a lawsuit if they're the ones that are doing this. And then, you know, just going back to your culture, remind them that the goal is to have a productive, safe workplace for everybody. On your policy, because I said that I would give you some tips, it's kind of the same as your discrimination policy. Let them know illegal harassment of any kind won't be tolerated. That includes all of those protected characteristics, but then also going into a little bit more detail about what constitutes sexual harassment. That can be, you know, jokes based on a person's sex or sexual orientation, or, you know, what we've all come to think of as sexual harassment, which is jokes that are sexually suggestive in nature. Saying if you experience harassment or you witness it, you need to report it. Again, having those multiple levels of reporting. So your direct manager, if you don't feel comfortable going to your direct manager, go to a member of HR or president or the board. You want to have those multiple avenues so that no one ever says, I couldn't tell that person. And with harassment, one thing that kind of came out of the Me Too movement is I always like to include a small blurb in these policies about if the complaint is directed at a member of senior management, you can complain to any other member of senior management or the board, or however your organization is structured, and then separating that person off from the investigation and potentially hiring outside counsel, someone like me, to come in and conduct the investigation too. We talked about this with discrimination a little bit. With harassment, I think it's much more important to say that we'll investigate everything promptly, keeping things confidential. Any violations are subject to discipline or discharge. None of this is super different from discrimination, but the content of what you're describing is obviously different. And then again, including that piece about retaliation is specifically prohibited. And then I touch on here the same kind of things that I touch on with discrimination. It doesn't matter the outcome of the investigation. The fact that the person reported it makes that protected and you can't retaliate against them. It's a lower bar. So again, not inviting that person to lunch might not be harassment, but it might be retaliation. And just reminding them of the culture that you want to have at your workplace. And then I always go through, these are my exact slides, and I'll try to make sure that I get them to you guys so that you have them and can refer back to them. But these are my exact slides of what do you do if you see or get a report of harassment. You don't bury your head in the sand. You promptly tell the people that you're supposed to tell per the policy. Usually that's you guys, HR. If an employee says, oh, you know what, please don't tell HR, I don't want to be involved. I explain to managers that that's not an option. You have to tell us. Then as HR, when you guys are investigating, if the person decides not to participate in the investigation, that's a totally different scenario, but managers don't get to honor those requests. They need to stay vigilant, watch for more of that, watch for retaliation. And then, just always keeping an eye out for unacceptable interactions and making sure that they step in and do, what's necessary. And then, like I said, I hope to get you guys these slides so that you can use them yourselves if you need it. But I included a bunch of examples here at the end that you might use for these ones that relate to discrimination. And then these ones are harassment. But I think that it helps. Sometimes I do these at the end, sometimes I do them at the beginning, just gauging interest and letting people know that sometimes this isn't as black and white as they think it might be. And those examples really help getting people to see that and think about it, and understanding that it's important to reach out to HR, because if they can't answer that hypo, then what are they going to do when it comes up at work? And it's probably more complicated than what I wrote down. So I know we have a couple of minutes left. I wanted to make sure I saved a little bit of time for questions, if there are any, but if not, it was great to talk to you guys. I haven't done this since before the pandemic, so it was great to be back and get to talk to everybody.
Good question. Danielle, thank you very much. Questions? Yes, yes.
When you get back to someone after an investigation, what is your recommendation if that person's not happy with the result? You've not terminated the manager that they think should have been terminated, or that you said several times, you respond to the complaint and to the person that made the complaint, but I've had times where they weren't happy with what your result is.
Yeah, so I think that you bring up a good point. And sometimes during harassment investigations, I say, let's interview the complainant first and let's ask them, what do they want to see out of this? And then you kind of know going through what their expectation is, and maybe that helps you in your decision-making process as well. But ultimately, I guess, what your question is focusing on is you guys did an investigation, you determined what happened, and based on what you decided, you're taking X action, and that's not enough for the person. It doesn't really matter. You don't have to, even if you ask that person early on, what do you need to feel, what do you want to feel comfortable after this? Don't make any promises, but try to gauge what their expectation is. And ultimately, if you don't do that, it doesn't matter because they don't really have a say. You are ultimately the decision maker, and the law says that you get to make the decisions based on the information that you have in front of you at the time, as long as it's reasonable. So I think practically you can think about how that's going to work. If the person says, I wanted this guy fired and he's still my manager, is that the action that you want to take then? But you can't let that person go or transfer that person. But you can say, we conducted the investigation. We didn't find any merit to the complaints. Happy to talk to you about it further, but that's our decision, and this is the action that we're going to be taking. And they're probably going to quit. So again, it's a practical thing where you have to think about, what do they expect? Do you want them to leave? Is there some action you could take that kind of balances it and makes everybody happy? But if you run through that and there's no way to do it, then, as long as it's a reasonable decision, they just have to live with it.
Or call their attorney.
Yeah. And then we all get involved, and then, but I've had that happen before where someone calls an attorney, the attorney calls me and they say, nothing happened. And then I can kind of run through the investigation and say there was no way that we found, no corroboration, whatever the results of the investigation were. Again, not to beat the dead horse, but it all goes back to the documentation again there. That's why that's so important. But if I have that documentation in front of me, I can say they did a reasonable investigation and they came to a reasonable conclusion. And that's all we're required to do under the law. And I've had those attorneys go away and tell the client, hey, there's nothing that we can do here.
Thank you. Good question. Any others? Well, Danielle, thank you again. You certainly wouldn't know that you put this together in 3 days or a presentation. Great job. Thank you so much for presenting this.